Good day, everyone. So, our next topic is all about the global interstate system. So, the state has traditionally been the subject of most interest to scholars of global politics because it is viewed as the institution that creates warfare and sets economic policies for a country. Furthermore, the state is a political unit that has authority over its own affairs. So, in other words, its borders are recognized by other countries. It is assumed that whoever is in charge of those borders has the right to determine exactly what is going to happen in their country. So, global governance in the 21st century. So, there is a series of specific factors behind the emergence of global governance. The first on the list must be the declining power of nation states. If states themselves were highly contingent and in flux, it would open the possibility of the emergence of some form of global governance to fill the void. A second factor is the vast flows of all sorts of things that run into and often right through the borders of nation states. So this could involve the flow of digital information of all sorts through the internet. It is difficult, if not impossible, for a nation state to stop such flow, and in any case, it is likely that such action would be politically unpopular and bring much negative reaction to the nation state involved in such an effort. For example, the China's periodic efforts to interfere with the internet have brought great condemnation both internally and externally. Then there is mass migration of people and their entry, so often illegally, into various nation states. If states are unable to control this flow, then there is a need for some sort of global governance to help deal with the problem. The flow of criminal elements as well as their products, for example, and drugs, laundered money, those bought and sold in sex trafficking, etc., mga sugadito hira, it is a strong factor in the call for global governance. So in these cases and others, there is a need for some degree of order, some sort of effective authority, and at least some potential for the improvement of human life. So another set of issues that has led to calls for global governance involves horrendous events within nation states that the states themselves either foment and carry out or are unable to control. For example, in Darfur, Sudan, perhaps hundreds of thousands have been killed, millions of people displaced, and lives of many disrupted in a conflict that dates back to early 2003. So the government of Sudan and its military have been implicated in the conflict between ethnic and tribal groups, and the Sudanese government has been resistant to outside interfere in its internal affairs. So then there are global problems that single nation state cannot hope to tackle on their own. One is the global financial crisis and panic that sweep the world periodically, which nations are often unable to deal with on their own. So next is the effects of globalization to governments. So one of the key aspects of state sovereignty is the government. So it is of the people who have the ultimate authority to act on behalf of a state. Each state has its own right to self-determination, and that the other country should not intervene in the affairs of that state unless there are extraordinary reasons to do so. So other countries must recognize sovereignty or the right to govern one's own territorial borders. So each state is autonomous unto itself and responsible within its own system of government to those who are governed. So the decisions, tapos ang iya conflict, and the resolution nito na conflict are done through the institutions of government established and codified in that particular state, whether or not through elections. So elections, especially sa mga democratic society, provide the leadership of the state. So the policy is developed and implemented in the interest of the people of a state by specific government. So ang mga civil society, ito na state, pwede lo tira mag-counterweight or as a supplement to government. So, ini nga mga civil society includes the private economy, educational institutions, churches, hospitals, fraternal organizations, and other non-profit organizations. Next is the traditional challenge. So, external intervention can generally be described as invasion by other countries. For example, when Saddam Hussein was the ruler of Iraq in 1990, he decided he was going to take over the oil fields of Kuwait. He invaded and Kuwait and iya took over. So as a result, he was dislodged by an international coalition led by the United States. So these days, we can see external intervention in other forms. For example, Russia's external intervention into the affairs of Ukraine. So a sovereign state in the post-Soviet era is another instance of intervention in the autonomy of the state. So the challenges from national or identity movements. So the next challenge are part of a national identity or movement. It is important to know that a nation has cultural identity that people attach to, while a state is a definite entity due to its specific boundaries. However, different people with different identities can live in different states. For example, the Kurds reside in several different countries including Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. So the Catalans live primarily in Spain, but we can also find some of them in France. So, ang mga Scottish nationalism liwat is another example that challenges the traditional notions of state sovereignty. So, global movements such as the Al-Qaeda and ISIS are another example of national or identity movements. So, in this case, they are structured around the fundamentalist version of Islam. Next is the global economics. So, the third major source of challenge comes from global economics. So, global economy demands the states to conform the rules of free market capitalism. So, government austerity comes from developments of organizations that cooperate across countries such as WTO and regional agreements such as NAFTA, the European Union, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations or ASEAN. So, neoliberal economics or neoliberal capitalism started in the 1980s. So, it focuses on free trade and dismantling trade barriers. So, it made sure that the governments did not impose restrictive regulations on corporate presence as well as on the free flow of capital and jobs. So, a specific example to expand global economic influence is the use of IMF or International Monetary Fund and the World Bank enforcing government reforms in poorer countries. So, businesses from developed countries put their factories and pay people to build factories and produce goods in developing countries worldwide. So, iniya ng mga corporations, ira inibabaligyan products na itong developing countries. So, this is exacerbates rising inequality in the world. So, global social movements. So, finally, we have global social movements. So, most of the time, they are not seen as a threat, but they definitely challenge state sovereignty. So, social movements are movements of people that are spontaneous or that emerge through enormous grassroots organization. So, these social movements are transnational movements, which means they occur across countries and across borders. So, for example, an human rights movements nag-create ng public sentiment, value, and agenda. Parehas at Gabriela. So, the idea is that there are certain rights that states cannot neglect or generally what we call human rights. So, if a country decides that they are going to have a particular policy and if that policy violates the international standard of human rights, there is a challenge to the ability of states to fully implement it. For example, na laha America or ha United States. So, era position on the death penalty. So there is an international consensus with a few dissenting countries like China, South Africa, and Russia against the death penalty. So this means that if somebody is sentenced by death penalty and somehow he is in a country around the world, there are rules against that state extraditing into the United States. So next is the relevance of the state amid globalization. So the state is a distinctive political community with its own set of rules and practices, and that is more or less separate from other communities. It has 4 elements. So the people, territory, government, and sovereignty. So the first element of a state is a permanent population or the people. So this population does not refer to a nomadic people that move from one place to another in an indefinite time. This permanent presence in one location is strengthened by the second element of a state that defined territory. So a territory has clear boundaries. So a territory is effectively controlled by the third element, which is the government. So the government, it nagre-regulate its relations among its own people and with other states. So this means that the state is a formally constituted sovereign political structure encompassing people, territory, and its institutions on the one hand, and maintaining its autonomy from other states on the other hand. So it is important to differentiate the idea of nation from state. So, nation refers to a people rather than any kind of formal territorial boundaries or institution. It is a collective identity grounded on a notion of shared history and culture. So, if we talk about the Philippines as a state, we may refer to the Philippine government. Kung state tato istoryahan. The Philippine territory and its internal and external sovereignty. But if we talk about the Philippines as a nation, we refer to our shared collective notion of democracy, our history, and our collective identity. So in other words, the state is a political concept while a nation is a cultural concept. So this brings us to the concept of the nation state. It is a territorially bounded sovereign institution that governs individuals sharing a collective history, identity, and culture. So in reality, it is difficult to think of any nation as having any shared national identity. So the Philippines, although formally a state, has a variety of ethnic traditions. Diba? Iba-iba it aton traditions because we have many islands in the country. So, definitely, nagkakamay da kitahin, iba-iba nga traditions. So, next is the institutions that govern international relations. So, there are several international organizations that governments of countries around the world and individuals participate in. So this include the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, NAFTA, and NATO. There are also non-governmental organizations promoting social and economic growth. So let us go to peace treaties and military alliances, the UN and NATO. So global politics entails relationship of countries and different governments and non-governmental organizations. The UN is one of the leading political organizations in the world where nation-states meet and deliberate. However, it remains as an independent actor in global politics. The premise for its establishment was the restructuring of the world devastated after the Second World War. So, the term United Nations was coined by former U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1942. Its operations began on October 24, 1945, and it started with 50 representatives from different countries. The UN is not all about fight. It has a program called UNICEF, or the United Nations Children's Emergency Fund. Its primary goal is to help children around the world. So, they collect funds, tas distribute niya as emergency relief from famine and poverty and disease. For example, di ba Yolanda, nagkamay-ada kita, aw an UNICEF, dako an bulig haaton nga di. So, kay may da kasi nira, emergency fund. So, in terms of economic issues liwat, the main focus of the UN is the reduction of global inequality. So, environmental issues liwat such as pollution and hazardous waste are addressed through United Nations Environment Program. So, the UN also has the International Court of Justice or ICJ, usually referred to as the World Court. So, it is located in Netherlands in a town called The Hague. This is where countries can settle disputes in a court of law, as well as a place where war criminals and rulers who have done terrible things to their people can be put to trial for their crimes. Diba? For example, ni Duterte and iya extrajudicial killing. So if mawaray na nga ni hiya immunity because of his presidency, ang term itiya pagiging president, so may daman niya immunity for 6 years. After that, pwede hiya igpatawagit International Court of Justice, wherein dito hiya hihiring or dito hiya question para bumaton kung ano ba talaga ang iya kalakaran hiton na extrajudicial killing or EJK. So, next is the non-governmental organizations or NGOs. So another example of an international organization that was developed out of war is the Red Cross or Red Crescent in Muslim countries. It is considered as a non-governmental organization. So in addition to Red Cross, there are many NGOs dedicated to helping people around the world. So Doctors Without Borders provides free emergency healthcare in disaster areas, and Oxfam fights famine and disease. Amnesty International speaks out for human rights and political prisoners, and Save the Children helps kids get health care and education. So, global economic associations, the WTO and NAFTA. So, the next group is an economic association or WTO. It is made up of 162 countries around the world and was created with the goal of increasing free trade. So countries therefore can buy and sell goods from one another without placing taxes on imports or tariffs. So in addition, tariffs are used to protect businesses and companies inside their country. So another famous economic organization is NAFTA. This is an economic treaty between the United States, Canada, and Mexico in which the three countries trade freely without taxing each other. So NAFTA is not without critics either. So some American auto workers protested against NAFTA as several car companies moved their factories to Mexico in search for cheaper labor. So NAFTA, like WTO, represents the challenge in America of keeping manufacturing factories. So next is the globalization and globalism. So you probably think about links, connections, and interrelatedness of things, people, and countries when you encounter the word globalization. Am I right? However, when compared to the term globalism, globalization would be better described as the increase or decline in the degree of globalism. So what then is globalism? So globalism refers to the network of connections that transcends distances of different countries in the world. So in other words, the links among countries and people are better associated with globalism, while the speed in which they become linked with one another is globalization. So we can also differentiate globalism and globalization in terms of its thickness. So globalism is thin. As it becomes thicker, globalization happens. So this means that being able to connect countries in the world through a more dynamic and faster way is globalization. So, for example, ang global trade. So, in the past, the Silk Road served as the trade routes among countries in Europe and in Asia. So, aside from the trade of silk between the continents, other products, even illegal ones, were exchanged among traders and consumers. In addition, cultural interactions among people were made through their trades. However, they were felt by a relatively small group of people, most especially those who were actually on the road and did the trades. So the connections were not intense nor thick, in contrast to the contemporary world. So globalization becomes increasingly thick. Lastly is informationalism. So the question now is about the type of connection that exists and begins to increase in the contemporary world. So the answer lies on the growth of information as the binding force among people, things, and places around the globe. So this technological paradigm associated with computer science and modern telecommunication that replaces industrialism is called informationalism. So these are technology, the media, and the internet. So this is not to say that we do not need to produce material goods such as factories, clothes, and food. Rather, exchanging information and knowledge, which is clearly immaterial due to the three of the most cutting-edge aspects of the social world in general and globalization in particular. So technology, media, and the internet. So McLuhan and Fior argued that in the new media age, the importance lies in the medium, the way in which the message is transmitted, not necessarily in the content presented through the medium. So while globalization allowed the expansion of information, access to modern technologies is not a universal matter that is available to every person around the world, di ba? Kay ang internet nga ng technologies may niya limited by certain barriers. So these barriers include pwede lack of electricity, illiteracy, diri ra maaram gumamit, or the weak financial systems, waray nira ig-arakos. And then the government regulations. So that's it for this week. Thank you for listening.